Welcome back to our series on common mistakes authors make when pitching podcasts and how to fix or avoid them. This is Book Marketing Mania, and I'm your host, Kim Stewart. And last week, we talked about common podcast pitching mistake number 7, not sharing your speaking experience, and how you can fix it by gaining some experience and linking it in your pitch to make it easy on the host to say, yes, you are the next best guest I need on my show. So today, let's talk about common podcast pitching mistake number 8, pitching only when we launch our books. And I'll share why and how to avoid that common mistake when pitching podcast. So let's get to it. So what's wrong with pitching podcast only when we're launching our books? Isn't that the whole point? To guest on podcast and reach new readers and sell more books when we launch? Yes, that might be your goal for guesting. Or your goal might be one of several other ways like we talked about in episode 46. But let's talk about book marketing and book launching for a minute. Book marketing is a long game, right? So when we focus on marketing our books only during a short launch period, if indeed that's your plan, then we get rushed and we mass pitch host. We're sending cookie cutter pitches with the spray and pray approach, and we're only focused on our book and the timing of that release date and not the message for the listeners. And it's really difficult to time your podcast interviews with your launch date unless you spend a lot of time building relationships with hosts way ahead of your launch date, as hosts are batching their guest episodes further and further out. I talked to several hosts in November who had already recorded their episodes through March and were having to turn down guests because they wanted their episodes to air within a specific time frame. Which, side note, the host is in charge of the timing of their guest episodes, not the guest. And if you wait to pitch until right at your release date, you often miss out. I recently shared with my email list to pitch sooner, not later. And by building relationships with podcast hosts, like we talked about in episode 44, you can get on the host radar so much earlier than you ever imagined. So should we be pitching podcasts as part of our launch plan? Absolutely. But pitch long before and long after your book release. Let's think beyond just our launch date because we want to continue reaching new readers and selling books long after that, right? So to fix or avoid the common mistake of only pitching when you launch your book is to prioritize podcast pitching as part of your ongoing marketing plan. And shout out to Chandler Bolt, author of the book Published and host of the Self-Publishing School podcast. In his book, he writes, podcast guesting is an evergreen marketing asset for your book. And he has a whole chapter devoted to pitching podcasts as part of your one-year launch. Oh, y'all, you know he's speaking my love language. So set podcast pitching and guesting goals and make time for it as long as you have a God-given message to share. And your goals may change over time. Some seasons you're focused on getting the most exposure around your launch date, especially if you're a traditionally published author, as that's the time they've set aside to focus on your PR the most, and you want to take advantage of that. But what about the podcasts they don't hear back from before their contract is up? Or what about new shows that get started serving your target readers, but they start up after your PR contract is up and your big launch period is over? You don't want to miss out on the opportunity to serve those readers and listeners because podcast pitching and guesting is only on your mind at release date. In other seasons, you might be focused on email list growth, and really that should be every season, y'all, and can be your goal for guesting on podcasts any time of the year. Even before your book is in hand, you can start growing your email list and think about ways you can start serving them and getting them excited about your book. Other seasons, you might be focused on growing your own podcast, and guesting on other people's shows is the number one way to do that. Podcast listeners love to discover new shows, so when they hear you as a guest in their podcast player, it's so easy to hop over to your show and hit follow without ever having to leave the app where they're listening. That happens to me all the time when I hear a really great author and I make such a connection with them through the interview in my ears, I immediately want to go check out their podcast. In other seasons, you might be focused on showing agents and publishers that the topic of your book idea has interest because you're already out there serving your target readers today as a guest on podcast, and they're showing some interest that they would like to hear more on this topic. And the list goes on and on. And again, we dive into 9 different ways podcast guesting can help build your author platform on episode 46. Y'all, there's always going to be new readers to reach. There's always going to be new listeners tuning into podcasts, and they need the solutions that your God-given message brings to their everyday problems. So avoid the common mistake of only pitching to guests on podcasts when you are in book release mode, and prioritize podcast pitching in your ongoing marketing plan. And if you're ready to get started, grab my free video training on 5 steps to jumpstart your podcast pitching, and I'll link it here in your player. And if you need some one-on-one help with your podcast pitching plan, if you're stuck anywhere and just need to get some help moving forward, I'd love to jump on a call with you and chat. One of my clients, Selena, said, Kim not only helped me strategize, but the amount of resources that I received afterwards was even better. And I want to do the same for y'all. You can book a call with me at bookmarketingmania.com, and I'll also link it here in your player. And next week, we are going to tackle our final common podcast pitching mistake in the series, number 9, not tracking your progress. And I can't wait to help you fix it. See you next week.